all its drama and power, the impact of our recent extreme weather is nothing compared to history. Though 2014 was the wettest winter ever recorded, with floods of biblical magnitude, the human costs are not even on the same scale as in the past. In the 17th century, a devastating flood on the Somerset Levels killed over 1,000 people. And historical records show Britain has had storms that decimated whole regions in a single day. Our navy came close to collapse when 8,000 sailors perished. There's been plenty of extreme weather, but which is the worst we've ever had?
What makes a storm the worst? Should it be judged by the wind speed, or perhaps its duration, or maybe even because of the destruction it caused? And if it's destruction, is that measured by how widespread it was? Perhaps the cost of the destruction, or maybe even because of the number of lives that were claimed.
In our modern world, death tolls are a fraction of those of history. But does that mean that our storms are somehow less momentous? Or is it just that roughly the same meteorological events can produce very different outcomes on the ground? I'm Dr. Lucy Green. I've spent my career as a solar scientist studying the sun's effect on us. My work builds on a wealth of knowledge created by centuries of weather science. Mostly, these breakthroughs in our understanding have been driven by the need to combat the extremes of weather Britain is subject to, perched out on the exposed edge of the Atlantic. Did it by learning to adapt to its challenges. Modern Britain was forged by the extremes of its weather. One biting winter so cruelly exposed our national reliance on coal that Plan B accelerated in the nuclear age. When the Thames froze over in 1814, civil engineers were able to prevent a reoccurrence with a new generation of sleeker bridges that improved the river's flow. And pioneering meteorologists took to the skies to make the long-held dream of forecasting the weather a reality. Risking death from asphyxiation, some flew higher than Everest to find the sky's secrets.
Join me on a journey through some of the most terrifying weather to ever hit our shores and find out how these extreme events tested us British to our limits. On the 30th of January 1607, at roughly 9 in the morning, a wall of water moving faster than a greyhound can run hammered up the Bristol Channel and overran the rudimentary sea defences here in North Somerset. It wiped out entire villages and formed an inland sea that was over 3 feet deep and stretched for over 200 square miles. Waters raced in from the Bristol Channel over there on the horizon and came all the way up to Glastonbury Tor. The extent of the flooding and the devastation it caused meant that as many as 1,000 people died, and these were poor people from rural communities, men, women and children who worked on the land, and where I'm standing now became an island.
The water breached both sides of the Bristol Channel, flooding communities in South Wales and North Somerset. Striking in the morning, the floods hit at a time when everyone had left their homes and were outside working. The scale of the destruction was catastrophic. Whole villages were obliterated. And in this time before the scientific age, the terrified survivors looked to God for answers.
This is All Saints Church in Kingston Seymour, and even though we're roughly 1 mile from the coast here, the floodwaters came about 5 feet up the side of the building. It must have been shocking to see, and it prompted a moment of deep religious reflection, with a widespread conclusion that the waters were the result of God's punishment for the sins of the nation.
This disaster sparked a host of written pamphlets that declared the floods a divine warning. In Britain's overwhelmingly agricultural society, with everyone working in the fields, our ancestors were especially vulnerable to extreme weather. When the heavens opened, there was little they could do other than look to the same heavens for salvation. Today, the hand of God has been replaced by the insights of science.
So what do you think happened on that fateful day?
We know that at 9 o'clock in the morning it was high tide, and it was one of the biggest tides of the year. And we know it was really windy on that morning. We know it was a fearful storm with strong westerly winds. And on top of that, there was a storm surge. A storm surge is what the weather does to the sea surface. The low pressure and the strong winds can cause the sea to rise by 2 to 3 metres around British coastline. And that's a storm surge. And it's an addition of seawater over hundreds of square kilometres, which on top of that already big tide would have just rushed over the top of any seawater.
Now there is a competing theory, isn't there, that it was possibly caused by a tsunami rather than a storm surge. What do you think about that?
It has been suggested, but there's really no need to suggest that we know that the tide was the highest tide in a century. We're almost certain from the historical records that it was windy. That's what all of the parish registers and all of the chronicles of the time say. And the other thing to take into consideration is that 12 hours later, on the east of the country, in East Anglia, they had flooding there as well. So the same weather system then wreaked havoc on the other side of the country.
Whatever the cause, the impact of the flood was devastating. For the peasants farming the fields, there was nowhere to escape as the waters raced in. In the 17th century, few people could swim, and there was no warning. The extreme death toll resulted from the farming methods of the era as much as the weather itself.
In 1607, the floods took victims because they were working in the fields. Today, those jobs have been replaced by machinery. So, if an identical flood were to happen now, would it still be viewed as an extreme event?
In death toll, certainly not. But the devastation was so severe, such events spurred learned men to look beyond the divine for answers. Enlightenment science began the centuries-long quest for the answers to Britain's extreme weather. They started collecting data, and the 17th century saw a new concept, the weather diary.
When I was a young girl, I kept a weather diary, and this is one of them. Every single day I would make a note of whether it was sunny and warm or cold and windy or wet, and also how the weather affected my daily life. These were perhaps the first steps of the scientist coming out in me. But little did I realise at the time that I was following in the footsteps of a 300-year-old tradition.
One of the early diaries was kept by a man known by some as the father of meteorology.
He was the first curator of experiments at the Royal Society, and his archives are held here today. But he's also something of a forgotten genius. There are no known images of him, even though he laid the foundations for weather forecasting.
That pioneer was Robert Hooke, and he turned the art of chronicling the weather into a scientific endeavour.
This guide was written by Robert Hooke, and in the text he lays out a methodology to turn the record of weather into something that's scientifically useful. For the first time, a set of instructions were created to tell people how to monitor wind, temperature and air pressure. It's a far cry from the more descriptive journals that I kept as a child, and it meant that weather turned from something that was merely opinion into something that was scientifically useful information.
Robert Hooke's far-sighted idea was for a network of scientific observers across the kingdom to make weather deducible, an early vision of a Met Office. Hooke died in March 1703, just months before one of Britain's extreme weather events. Documenting this would fall to a more famous writer. Once he could get out of jail, that is.
November 1703, and a friendless and distressed man is released from Newgate Prison, which stood on that site just behind me, now the Old Bailey. The man described himself as ruined and without hope of deliverance. Yet an event was about to happen that would both devastate the country, but also change this man's fortunes. His name? Daniel Defoe, and he was about to chronicle the greatest storm in Britain's history.
With hurricane-force winds of up to 100 miles an hour. The storm path stretched from Birmingham to the south coast and ripped up the country as it moved east. Roofs tore off, houses blew apart. By the time the maelstrom subsided, over 8,000 Britons were dead.
Daniel Defoe was staggered by the ferocity, the damage and the impact. Surely such a mighty storm should be remembered. He placed adverts in 2 newspapers and solicited accounts from across the country to preserve the remembrance of the late dreadful tempest.
His call reached across the country to mayors, harbour masters and clergymen. Eyewitnesses recorded like never before, their testimonies brought to life by modern-day counterparts.
On one side whereof runneth the river Severn, which by reason of the violence of the late storm beat down and tore to pieces the sea wall in many places, and levelled it almost with the ground, forcing vast quantities of earth a great distance from the shore, and stones, many of which were above 100 weight.
In the midst of this churchyard grew a vast tree, thought to be the most large and flourishing elm in the land, which was torn up by the roots, some of which are really bigger than one's middle and several than a man's thigh.
Damages about our church testify how strong and boisterous the winds were, for they embedded 3 sheets of lead upon the uppermost roof and rolled them up like so much paper.
Daniel Defoe compiled these reports into a unique book, The Storm.
And this is it, the product of Daniel Defoe's diligent efforts. It's astonishing to be holding it. This is the definitive account of an extreme weather event from over 300 years ago, and each page carries its own personal and touching story. And it even smells like a musty old room. One account is from Brighton, where I used to live, or Brighthelmstone as it was known then, and it reads, Brighthelmstone, being an old-built and poor though populous town, was most miserably torn to pieces and made the very picture of desolation, that it looked as if an enemy had sacked it. This reads more like a war journal than a story about weather.
If the storm was harsh on land, it was horrific at sea. Seeking refuge, 700 merchant ships were smashed together in the Thames. Around the coast, a fifth of all sailors in Britain's navy were drowned and over 100 ships wrecked. At the time, British sea power was fueling dreams of a global empire. The storm came close to halting this. It was the first weather event to be a news story on a national scale. Much of this was down to Defoe's reportage, but he also strived to make the eyewitness accounts he gathered as scientifically valid as they were dramatic. He didn't just advance journalism, but weather science too. This would be a continuing theme in Britain's encounters with extreme weather. We learned from them and began to see how to control the weather's worst impacts. Up to the 18th and into the 19th century was a period where in some years average winter temperatures were as much as 2 degrees lower than today. It has become known as the Little Ice Age. This meant bleak winters, food and fuel shortages, in short, much suffering and hunger. The raw cold gave birth to London's very own glacier as the Thames froze over. London, the world's richest port, blocked solid, an economic disaster. Ship owners fretted, but the rest of London partied at frost fairs on the ice. With the authorities desperate to get the Thames moving, merchants and buskers plied their trade on London's gateway.
Every kind of food was for sale on that impromptu street. There was coffee, absinthe, winter ale, even one account of a sheep being roasted. They sold it for £1 a slice and rather ingeniously marketed it as Lapland mutton.
The raucous feasting was washed down with homebrew.
Some of the stalls sold Pearl, a brew of gin and wormwood wine. But due to its ruinous effects, these stalls became known as fuddling tents. And for their visitors, they must have had a perilous journey home across the ice.
Rowdy crowds, ice and potent booze, a health and safety nightmare. I asked an expert on the frost fairs, Georgina Young, just how dangerous it could be.
Well, they could be quite hazardous. The prints that we have of the frost fairs show people falling through the ice. They show people slipping over, and slips and trips can be quite serious at that time. I mean, if you broke a bone in 1814, that was no minor thing.
How many accidents were there?
Well, the records aren't all that clear, but we certainly know that on several occasions at frost fairs, people did fall through the ice and die. And there are accounts of people having been unable to be rescued, having fallen through. But I think the number of incidents of slipping and tripping must have been enormous.
The frost fair left a legacy of some bizarre mementos, which the museum has preserved.
What's this?
This, as far as we know, is the only surviving piece of gingerbread from the 1814 frost fair. So gingerbread was quite commonly sold on the ice. Kind of spicy foods go down well in a cold climate. So gingerbread was sold. It was obviously sold to be eaten, but this has a lovely story in that the family retained it. So the person who bought this actually hung on to it and passed it on to their daughter, who then passed it to the museum. So they kind of kept something that was supposed to be eaten on the ice and just held on to it until it became so special as a memento that they thought it's worthy of museum preservation.
And how about this one? This is also printed on the Thames as well, is it?
Well, this is really amazing. It's printed on the very last day of the very last frost fair, and it's a kind of comic message from A. Thaw to J. Frost, or Jack Frost, telling him to quit the Thames. So it's basically an indication that the ice is starting to melt and they know that the days are numbered for the frost fair.
It's a sort of tongue-in-cheek message for people to get back on safety of dry land.
Absolutely. This is basically one of the last things that would have been printed on the ice before everyone packed up and got off.
It's 200 years since anyone bought souvenirs at a frost fair. That's partly because our winters are slightly milder, but it's also because of the actions of 19th century engineers striving to improve navigation on the Thames. To do this, they remove one ancient river hazard, the chaotic old London Bridge.
This picture shows Old London Bridge with the Frost Fair happening in the foreground. The view is the same as the one behind me. You can see that the old bridge was supported by these series of very narrow arches, quite different to the bridge today. And that's key. These narrow arches hampered the flow of the river and they trapped pieces of floating ice, essentially forming an ice dam. Whereas today, the fast-flowing river moving through the broad arches freezes over much less easily.
The old London Bridge also acted like a weir, preventing the salty tidal Thames mixing with upstream fresh water. All the newer incarnations of the bridge allow brackish water further upstream. Just as salt is used to prevent icy roads, salt water acts as an antifreeze here. And the river itself has changed dramatically. In 1870, embankments were built, halving its width and speeding its flow. The Thames once lapped the river gardens of the Strand. In fact, Strand means shore in Old English. Now the river is over 100 metres away. The water gates of Somerset House once welcomed Admiralty yachts, but now just greet delivery trucks.
So yes, the winters were on average colder back then, but the Thames froze because it was quite a different river.
The Victorians had shown they had the power to change the impact of severe weather. And soon, solitary weather watchers were being organised into a countrywide network of observers. But Victorian meteorologists were caught by surprise when Britain's coldest ever temperature was recorded in 1895. I'm travelling into the Cairngorm Mountains to visit the site of this record-breaking low and to find the reasons behind this extreme in the village of Braemar.
Welcome to Ice Station Braemar. The inside of this curious little hut holds the record for the official coldest place in Britain, not once but twice over. In 1895 and again in 1982, a mind-numbing temperature of minus 27.2 degrees Celsius was recorded in this building. That's 10 degrees lower than your freezer.
It may have lost its grandeur, but this is a royal palace to weather data. The station was a gift from Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, back in 1855. Robert Hooke's 17th century dream of predicting the weather through diligent measurements was realised in the Victorian age. From the heart of the village, it's hard to see why Braemar gets such extremes. It becomes clearer as you head into the surrounding heights.
For most of the UK, in the coastal regions, the sea regulates our temperatures. Scorching summer heats are cooled by sea breezes, whilst in the winter, the warmth of the ocean heats the air around us. But Braemar is right in the heart of Scotland. It's over 50 miles to the sea in every direction. There's nothing here to stop those extreme temperatures.
These mountains are stunning, but they're also a mammoth parasol. In midwinter, the sun is so low in the sky it barely makes it above the peaks surrounding Braemar, and the village gets less than 3.5 hours of sunshine a day.
From this viewpoint, you can see that Braemar is nestled in the bottom of this valley, and that turns it into something that's known as a frost hollow. During the night, cold, dense air sinks down onto the town and the temperature plummets. So if you put all these things together, you can see why the town's weather station has the record for coldest temperature in Britain.
Braemar's weather centre was just a tiny part of a growing network of weather stations. Since its birth in 1854, the Met Office had begun cataloguing every nuance of Britain's meteorology. Archive data meant weather patterns could be detected, giving advance warning of extremes. And not just for bitter winters. During one searing heatwave in 1858, the Thames turned into a concentrated, fermenting mass of sewage. Parliament considered relocating as temperatures hit record highs of over 32 degrees, and the smell became hard to bear. Surely better science could prevent this. Ambitions were high. Victorian researchers had tamed the chemical elements, making reactions predictable. Were the skies also a giant laboratory to be understood and controlled? Scientists might then become rainmakers and defeat drought. To gain knowledge, some meteorologists would put themselves in peril. James Glaisher was more weather boffin than Victorian adventurer, yet in the daring spirit of the age, he realised the best way to study the sky was to be up in it. In 1862, Glaisher raised funds for the Mammoth, then the largest balloon ever built. Once full of hydrogen, the balloon was cast off. The only way down again was to pull a release valve. They had a pilot, Henry Coxwell, but finding a scientist proved fruitless. Eventually, the 53-year-old Glaisher agreed. Unbeknown to him, he was about to risk his life for meteorology. Could the Mammoth help him discover the mysteries of the atmosphere? To do this, Glaisher took with him more than 20 instruments. One was to prove important, the wet-dry thermometer. As liquid water becomes vapour, it chills its surroundings. That's why humans sweat to cool down. By measuring the strength of this cooling, you can estimate how dry the air must be. The drier the air, the lower its humidity.
The key to the experiments is this. It's a hygrometer. It contains two thermometers, a wet thermometer and a dry thermometer. On the wet one, the water evaporates and it lowers the temperature reading, whereas the dry thermometer just gives us the temperature of the ambient air around it. The difference in temperature on these two thermometers can be used to tell the humidity of the air around us. So on the wet thermometer, I have a reading of 8 degrees, and on the dry, I have 14 degrees, and I can use those numbers, look them up on my chart, and I see that I get a relative humidity of about 24%, and that's at a height of around 500 feet above ground level. And this is exactly the kind of instrument that Glaisher would have used during his early pioneering balloon flights.
Rising higher and higher, Glaisher found humidity dropped, with air getting ever drier. He also observed that the atmosphere was like a swirling sea with different currents moving at different speeds. Glaisher had taken an early step in understanding high-altitude conditions. Today we know such currents, like the jet stream, are key drivers of Britain's weather systems. My balloon barely reached 2,000 feet. The courageous Glaisher went much, much higher. By now, the duo had soared to the height of Everest. With the higher altitude, oxygen levels dropped, and Glaisher was soon struggling to breathe.
Glaisher's sight started to fail, he lost control of his limbs, and then he blacked out. But still, the balloon rose.
The pilot Coxwell could not release the balloon's gas.
As it rose, the balloon had spun wildly, wrapping the gas release cord into the balloon's rigging and out of the men's reach. With no way down, the balloon soared higher and higher. Death looked inevitable.
The balloon was 7 miles up, higher than a jumbo jet. Glacier was unconscious. Now it was left to Coxwell alone to bring them down. He climbed into the rigging to try and seize the release valve, but his frostbitten hands were losing feeling. Instead, he was forced to pull the release valve with his teeth. It worked. Finally, the balloon began to descend. For a full 7 minutes, James Glacier was out cold.
Finally, Glacier awoke. "I have been insensible," he said, and then got straight back to making his measurements.
Glacier's readings suggest he had reached a world record-setting 37,000 feet, higher than any human before. He had helped our understanding of the atmosphere, but the dream of switching off drought remained elusive. Meanwhile, the Met Office's influence was growing. By harnessing greater scientific understanding of the processes that drive weather, the accuracy of its forecast was improving. At the start of the 20th century, radio technology began to help supply data more swiftly to forecasters. Yet extremes were still often surprises in 1932 and 34. But these were nothing compared to weather so extreme it brought the country close to collapse. In 1947, Britain was limping from a global conflict. Its infrastructure was crippled and the economy near bankruptcy. A vicious winter was the last thing the nation needed.
It came from nowhere. On the 17th of January 1947, it was a balmy 14 degrees Celsius, but the temperature soon dropped. The first frost came in on January the 20th, and it was followed 3 days later by snow. Snow fell somewhere in Britain on every single day for almost 8 weeks. It was the heaviest snowfall that the country had experienced since records began.
The snow ground everything to a halt. The rail network, on which the country still depended, blocked up with 15-foot drifts. Coal still fueled Britain then, but the mines were struggling. 75,000 extra miners were needed to meet demand, and there was no cash to buy imported coal.
The Minister of Fuel and Power, Manny Shinwell, had faith that the new spirit of his recently nationalised coal industry would increase its yield. But he had gambled on a warm winter, and the coal stocks, which were already low following the Second World War, were at breaking point even before the winter weather set in. Now they reached crisis levels.
The total reliance on coal for heating, for the rail network, for power stations and for industry left Britain vulnerable. The place just shut down. 2 million workers were sent home. But home brought few comforts.
I think this is awful. No coal, no toast, no bread, no fat, no bacon, no eggs.
People queued for hours to collect coal. They tried to keep smiling through as they waited for their meagre ration. The victors of World War II struggled in houses with little coal to heat them or power to light them. Government opponents talked of shivering with Shinwell.
There are many moving stories. At one Manchester depot, a man demanded extra coal at gunpoint. But when he came before the magistrates, it's clear where their sympathies lay. He was fined £1 and had his revolver confiscated. In desperation, people burned anything they could get hold of. Railway sleepers, coal dust mixed with cement, some even burning shoes. The country was dying of cold.
In the first 3 months of 1947, over 25,000 more people died than the previous year. How many for lack of warmth? This harsh lesson taught us not to rely solely on coal for electricity. As the winter warmed, plans for nuclear power stations were raced through. Reliable electricity from uranium is 1947's legacy. No Briton would be forced to burn their shoes again. Just a few years later, in 1955, Scotland suffered another brutal winter. Blizzards swept in and cut off isolated regions. Yet this time, the nation was ready. The government launched Operation Snowdrop.
The pilot and crew looked down upon a white wilderness, searching for letters spelt out in the snow that tell
The
them...
stricken Highlanders were told to write out signals in the snow: F for food, D for doctor, and C for cattle fodder. 30 helicopters and many planes dropped fresh bread, tins, and even cigarettes. Flight after flight took off from HMS Glory. Operation Snowdrop shows that our memory of extreme weather can change depending on our preparation. But sometimes there's no time to ready yourself for the worst.
This is Lynmouth on the edge of Exmoor. It's incredibly calm and tranquil today. But on the evening of 15th of August 1952, it was the scene of what one witness called destruction worse than the heaviest blitz. It stuns the human mind, they said. On that evening, from out of nowhere, a wall of water came crashing down this street, carrying with it over 100,000 tonnes of debris. Huge boulders ripped up the road, over 20 bridges were obliterated, and almost 100 buildings were destroyed. But worst of all, 34 people lost their lives.
Lynmouth, a picture postcard town, was at the height of the holiday season. Many of the tourists were staying close to the river. While Britain slept, Lynmouth was savaged. Dawn revealed the carnage.
I am now standing on the front steps of my hotel. What you see in front of you, this raging torrent, was originally the main road from Minehead through Lynmouth to Linton. About 9:30, there was a tremendous roar. The West Lynn had broken its banks and dashed against the side of the hotel, bringing with it thousands of tons of rocks and debris. At about 2 a.m., the rear portion of the hotel collapsed with a tremendous roar. But luckily, the main building stood, and we survived the night.
The flash flood started far from Lynmouth, high on the hills of Exmoor. It began when 9 inches, or 23 centimetres, of rain fell in 24 hours. 3 months' rain in a single day. Hitting ground already saturated, the rain simply raced into the streams. These streams united in rivers, growing ever stronger.
And this is where two of the rivers meet, the East Lynn and Horrock Water. each carrying a substantial amount of that floodwater collected from across a vast area. At this confluence point, a vast wall of water grew as it was funnelled by the steep valley sides, and it was headed straight for Lynmouth.
But this was no steady torrent.
The flow came in bursts. The bridges trapped trees and boulders, creating a temporary dam, which then breached, creating a 12-metre high wave that swept through here.
All the water running off 40 square miles of moorland funnels into Lynmouth, yet this did not stop Victorian builders thinking they could control it.
The course of the river had been diverted years before, and as this popular tourist destination developed, new houses were built on the old river channel. But nothing was going to stop this deluge. As it came crashing through, it smashed the houses to pieces, carrying everything out to sea, including the people.
The victims were of every age, babies, teenagers, and the elderly. Perhaps most tragic of all, a woman's body was found, which was never identified. She remains unknown. Lynmouth had flooded before, but never to this magnitude. Had something changed in the landscape to multiply the effect of the rain? To increase the profits of Exmoor, Victorians had drained the mossy bogs by digging ditches. These bogs, which once acted as sponges, now became pasture for grazing sheep. Rain on the moors had little to stop it flowing straight into the rivers, exacerbating floods. Today, over £2 million is being spent to fill in the ditches and restore the peat bogs. Early tests show this should cut the water entering rivers by a third. About a quarter of Britain was once wetland, yet as our bond with the land has altered, we have forgotten this.
In some senses, it feels like we've come full circle, and perhaps because we've had a rather short-sighted view on the use of this land, human intervention that ultimately improved the yield for farming actually ends up putting Lynmouth at risk of flooding.
But now we are beginning to look back to nature to control the flow of water. Around the country, such actions upstream can help reduce the flooding downstream. Throughout Britain's history, changing our landscape has transformed the impact of weather. There are few clearer examples than where we reclaim land from nature. Canvey Island on the Essex coast was one such man-made place. We are not the owners of the land, but nature's temporary tenants. Post-war, houses sprung up as families started new lives away from ruined London. Simple, one-storey, prefabricated houses. But they built on borrowed land. Nature was ready to take it back, smashing its way down Britain's east coast. The first most people on Canvey Island knew of the surge of water was when it hit their homes.
Canvey Island was about to fall victim to the fatal trio that create a storm surge. First, the air pressure that normally pushes down on the surface of the sea reduced, creating a bulge in the water. And that was on top of an already high tide. Then, gale-force winds brought that bulge towards the shore. And here, at Chooks Creek, is where that mass of water burst through the flood defences.
Families were evacuated across the island. Here, Elizabeth Howard and her children escaped by boat. Her son Ray, who was then just 11, explained how the floodwaters struck.
My sister came into our room and to say there's water gushing down the street. And the street that we are covering now, it was just looked out the window and you see it just gushing down.
So we're coming up
He
to the
took
house.
me to his family home.
How does it feel to see it again?
Yes, it brings back memories considerably. I mean, it was 62 years ago, so that's a very long time ago, but it still is in my mind and always will be.
I've got here an aerial shot of Canvey and the floods. Which one of these is yours?
This one here at the end.
So you can see just the extent of the flooding. This whole area is covered.
Absolutely. Canvey has an acreage of 4,500, and obviously, so it's a small island, but you can see how much flooding took place, particularly in certain sections of Canvey. And so they didn't have lots of money in those days, so they'd go and buy a plot of land for next to nothing and build a little shack.
Ray Howard would only discover who when he returned to school.
It was a very sad occasion to hear the different stories of what had happened to other parts of the island and families. Some lost their mums or dads, or indeed their brothers or sisters, or their relatives. Boys and girls in certain classes didn't return.
A simple warning could have saved many such lives. Today, Canvey Islanders are not only protected by this flood defence wall, they, like much of Britain, have a storm surge warning service too. When surges are forecast, the population evacuates. Whilst we cannot switch off such weather, we've learnt to make floods less deadly.
Today, the houses of Canvey Island shelter behind this rather impressive wall of concrete and steel, a brutal solution to protecting themselves from the potentially destructive force of the sea. But with the water levels constantly rising, how long will this approach last?
Britain's most extreme weather events have chiefly involved excess water in many forms: rain, snow, or the sea. But at times, water is the one thing we crave. One extreme weather episode is burnt into our national psyche, the benchmark by which all summers are judged: scorching 1976. In one 15-day blast, the temperature reached 32 degrees Celsius every day. As the nation basked in the heat, they were deaf to Met Office alarm bells.
Well, I think it's likely to stay pretty hot over the next 2 or 3 days. We're getting very close to records now, so it's difficult to forecast an actual record, but I think pretty hot, staying up close to 90.
Rainfall had been drying up since the previous autumn. The next 16 months were the driest since the reign of George II. As reservoirs emptied, it gradually hit home. Could we actually run out of water? Crops shriveled.
The intense heat and lack of rain has had a disastrous effect on cereals south of a line from the Wash down to the Severn.
Fires burning with no water to extinguish them were no joke.
The fire service has also been hard-pressed in other areas. Thousands of gallons of sewage have been used on one fire to help conserve dwindling water supplies.
Roasting sewage wasn't the only thing causing a big stink. Water wars became class wars.
In the middle of dried-up, drought-ridden, water-tortured London, welcome to an oasis. Its name, Hampstead Golf Club. On the day that the Prime Minister has called a cabinet meeting about the water crisis, and as people in some parts of the country have no water at all, the ladies and gentlemen of Hampstead Golf Club can safely have a round or two in the knowledge that their greens, at least, are beautifully soft and moist.
Such cavalier attitudes wilted. Water meters and protocols to enforce restrictions were to be the legacy of an era when the nation's tank almost ran dry. Though 1976 broke records for lack of rain, Britain's highest temperatures were reached more recently, in the summer of 2003. I'm on my way to visit the hottest place on our island.
An exceptional summer gets even hotter. Hotter, in fact, than has ever been recorded before. This was the South Coast today.
Heathrow Airport was the first to break records, reaching 37.9 degrees Celsius. Through the day, other weather stations relayed their data to the Met Office. Heathrow's record was soon topped.
Gravesend in Kent earned a place in the record books today, topping 100 degrees Fahrenheit at 38.1 degrees Celsius.
10th of August 2003, the date of a battle over extreme weather supremacy. It was the hottest day of the year, no one contested that, but what was argued over is exactly where that maximum was reached. The crown first went to Gravesend with a scorching 38.1 degrees Celsius, but then the results came in from this volunteer weather station who recorded 38.5. But could they take the crown? Met Office officials came and checked the equipment, and even though it's still argued over today, it is this farm in Brogdale that holds that extreme weather record.
Landscape once again had helped shape our weather. This beautiful Kent farm reached this weather extreme because it lies close to an urban heat island, London. The concrete jungle absorbs more heat than vegetation does, not least the tall buildings with multiple sunlit surfaces. This hot air drifted to Brogdale, helping to warm it to record highs. Across Europe, the heatwave of August 2003 caused the biggest fall in agricultural output for 100 years and over 30,000 deaths, many of them old people. As a result, we've learned to educate those at risk, to rehydrate as the temperature rises, and we've created community cooling centres for the most vulnerable. It is very likely, according to Oxford University scientists, that human influence had more than doubled the probability of such extreme temperatures. Future fears about global warming tend to focus on the potential for severe heat waves. Yet as a maritime nation, it's the impact on our seas and estuaries that I find most worrying. Some of our greatest extremes, the floods in 1607 and the storm surge of 1953, came from the sea. But across our history of extreme weather, we have one real success story. The Thames Barrier. If a storm surge is forecast, giant walls are lifted to block it reaching the city. Repeatedly, London has been protected by this technology. But has it made London think the threat has subsided?
In November 2007, weather forecasters predicted a storm surge that would be a once-in-50-year event. So, would the happenings of 1953 be repeated? Well, this time it was a completely different story. Warnings were issued and the public were alerted. The sea defences held. Just. The water lapsed to within 10 centimetres of their tops. And this barrier here prevented the surge from flooding London. Human ingenuity had beaten nature. Luckily, the storm passed and didn't end in tragedy. But ironically, it means that this event has all but been forgotten.
The human memory is a poor weather archive. Our successes are forgotten and disasters remembered. Weather's impact will always be wedded to human actions, for good and for ill. When the 1607 floods struck the area near this hill, the people felt powerless to prevent it. The The difference with modern day storm surges is that we can look to science for protection, warning and rescue. Today, we have improved our ability to keep the water out, and we have advanced warning of what is coming. Yet, that is changing. We live in a warming world with rising sea levels. I've never met a climate scientist who would disagree with that. Without knowing the climate ahead, predicting the weather extremes of the future is still beyond our current ability.
One message has been clear to me throughout my journey. We ignore nature at our peril. We reclaim land from the sea and then build insufficient defences, but yet are surprised when we suffer the tragedy of people's homes being drowned. We don't increase the fuel stocks and then people die when the coal runs out. And in 1975 we wasted water, yet we were surprised by a drought the following year. Time and time again, human folly amplifies the impact of nature on our lives. So, what does nature have in store for us next?
One thing is for sure, the future will be no less harsh than the past. The only question is, are we up to the challenge?
Archive and imagination combine here on BBC4 Next as we ask whether we could survive a mega tsunami. Sobering stuff in just a moment. And then classic drama continues with Edge of Darkness at 11. Stay with us.